Hello and welcome to another Wilderness Labs Dev Camp session. My name is Adrian and I'm going to talk to you about data storage on IoT with C# and Meadow using SQLite .NET. Now, I think before we go too far, we should probably talk about what SQLite is. And it's a lightweight relational database, and it really has become an industry standard. We see it on a ton of mobile, and of course it's accessible on desktop as well. And for Meadow, it's available on the platforms that Meadow supports. And if you're using a Meadow F7 based device, it's actually built in to that Meadow operating system. And SQLite, it is lightweight. When we say lightweight, we think sometimes SQL, we think server. And it's not a server, it's actually a single file, but it's still relational. It allows us to do that relational data storage on a low power device without getting in the way of the rest of our application. Now, SQL is fantastic, and being able to do CRUD operations with SQL is really powerful, but hey, we're .NET developers, and we don't want to have to do low-level SQL statements. We want to really rather use a C# API, and this is where SQLite .NET comes in. In SQLite .NET, it's a .NET ORM, and if you don't know what that means, it's an object relational mapper. It says it here. It maps C# .NET classes to database tables. And I'm going to show you how this works in code in just a moment. But what this does is it really simplifies our ability to store model objects into a database and retrieve it and inflate them and then use that data again in our code. Again, without having to do a lot of low-level SQL statements. Really simplifies all those create, read, update, and delete operations that we do very often with our relational databases. So let's take a look at a bit of code. So I've actually opened up the SQLite sample. This is available in the Meadow core samples. I'll show you that in GitHub in just a moment. And I want to show you how we wire this up and how we use it. And for those of you that are familiar with SQLite.NET, this is going to feel really familiar. And if you haven't used it before, it's actually pretty quick to learn. So first things first, hey, we're C# developers, we're .NET developers. How we get new libraries into our projects? We use NuGet. So if you're going to add it to a Meadow project, you're going to search for SQLite-net-static. Let's just tune that in. And we're going to bring in this package here, SQLite NET static. And what's great here, you can see the description. Open source lightweight library providing easy SQLite database storage for .NET, Mono, Xamarin applications, and hey, and Meadow as well. And if we go to our project, we'll see that package has been added. There it is, using version 1.8. I haven't tried the latest pre-release yet. I'd be curious to give that a go. So now we have our package. Well, heck, we can start working with SQLite. So let's go to our Meadow app class. And I love a good sample where things are streamlined. So the first thing we do is we make what we call a SQLite connection. And that's going to be exactly our connection to that database, really that connection to our database file. And we'll see how that's wired up. And although it's not exactly directly the database, it really is our gateway to the database. And so I actually like this naming of, we're going to just call it the database. If you're digging under the hood, it's conceptually a tiny bit different. So we make a SQLite connection. Let's see how we use this in our code. I'm just going to zip on down to where we create it. And I want to go to the initialize method, pardon me. Actually, it's perfect. Configure database. So if we go to configure database, so the first thing we need is we need a path to that file. Again, it's not a SQL server. We have a single file that's actually representing and storing our database information. And on Meadow, if you're using F7, you're going to use Meadow OS. Then you access the file system. I love a good .NET API. And we want to use the data directory. And this is all built in the API, so meadowos.filesystem.data directory. And then, of course, we give it a file name. And standard convention is to name that file .db. Of course, the OS, the library does not care what you call it, but that is good convention. Hey, MySQLite database, you might want to name it something meaningful for your application. But again, it's your data storage mechanism. And then back to that connection. So here, I love the API. So we take the path, we pass it in, and we instantiate a SQLite connection object. And now we're ready to go. And you can see right here for configure database, look at this. Path, instantiate, create a table. No SQL in sight. So let's take a look at this. So we're creating a table, and notice it's a generic, and we're going to use a sensor model. So what is sensor model? Let's take a quick look at that. Again, set up as a sample, we give it a model name that's meaningful for our data. If we were doing atmospheric data collection, we might call it our atmospheric model or environmental model or whatever our specific application is. And again, we just decorate it with SQLite attributes. And so we give it a table name. In this case, it's called sensor readings. We always set a primary key, and auto increment is a good idea, so we don't have to manage that ourselves. And then we add a couple properties. And notice we don't have to decorate these ones. We just decorate the primary key, and off we go. Now, there are other attributes. I'm not going to go into all the details of the API. It's very well documented, very commonly used in mobile. Lots of good examples out there if you want to go a bit deeper. But here we go. We've got a value and a timestamp, and then our primary key, our ID. I love this. A nice, simple model object. And so if we go back, again, create our table. This is now going to create a table that represents our sensor data. So really all that's left now is, well, how do we read and write to our database? And let's take a look. So right here, so again, we've got an example method for inserting some data. And the important part here, let's just separate this out a little bit. Let's get to the goods of this here. So we use our database connection, and we call the insert method. And here, look at this. We're just instantiating a new sensor model object. Now, of course, you might have some domain logic that's creating these from sensor data. This is just a nice, simple example, but it's just a sensor model object. This is a model object. We've already created a table for it, and now our database connection knows how to write that to the table. And again, we're just putting some values here, a timestamp and a value for our sensor. And these, of course, can be more complex as long as we're following the property types that are applicable to SQLite, which is pretty flexible, floats and integers and such. And there we go. Look at that. Create a table, insert data. And again, let's just scroll down and see how we retrieve the data. And it is just as simple as that. When I pull the data back out, again, beautiful here. We access our SQLite connection. And then we just access the table directly. And look at this. This is actually going to pull out the rows. There are some convenience methods used with link as well and do some other things. But again, really the read and write, which is probably what we'll be using 90+% of the time in our IoT applications, this is really beautiful. We pull the data out, and then, of course, we can see we're just going to go through here and we're going to access the data. And what we might do in other cases is, hey, a really good use case for this might be, maybe we're going to batch our data, and we're going to send that up to a web service, or maybe even more likely some sort of edge server where it's going to grab data from multiple IoT devices. Or maybe we're going to come by with a mobile device and connect over BLE or over Wi-Fi and pull that data out. And so this gives us a really nice, robust way of doing some local data storage without heavily burdening and without installing a lot of services on our device. Worth mentioning, of course, too, as we're getting into more, high volume devices with things like a Meadow core compute module. Well, there is SD card support, and so you can use the SD card for storage of your SQL data. Again, and just a little caveat, we obviously don't want to be using this as a server. I wouldn't recommend, say, using something like our Maple server and trying to host a website and doing a whole bunch of data in and out. But it is a really amazing way to collect sensor model data, store that out, and then send it off to the appropriate service or device we need to process that data. So before I wrap it up, I just want to show you where all of this code is. And I do really like this code. It's a nice, clean example and extensible. If we go over to GitHub and go to the Meadow core samples repo in Wilderness Labs, again, I'll also zoom that in. GitHub, Wilderness Labs, Meadow core samples, again, pretty easy to find. All open source, and I think, oh, look at that. We even have an example in Visual Basic. That is pretty fantastic. So you can jump in here, get all this code, bring a new good package, create your connection, and start doing relational data on Meadow. Happy coding.